Good morning, everybody. Congratulations for getting up very early, particularly after that wonderful night that we had last night. You've done very well. I can't quite believe that I'm here on time. I'm not sure that I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but I'm looking forward to this morning's session. So welcome and thank you for coming to the Qualifications Breakfast. My name's Anne Riddell. I'm a member of the ACECQA board. I'm from Queensland and most recently, well, for the last 20 years actually, I worked for the department which was the regulatory authority in Queensland. So the national quality reforms are near and dear to my heart, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. This session consists of 3 presentations, one by Emma Richards of the Community Services and Health Industry Skill Council, ACECQA. That's how I pronounce it anyway. I'm not sure what the official pronunciation is, Emma. Maybe you can correct me. Another presentation by Edmund of the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, commonly known as ACER, because we like to shorten all of our titles to acronyms. And then one by Chris Mason of the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, ACECQA. So these presenters represent 3 very key stakeholders in the provision of quality early childhood educators to the early childhood education and care sector. All play a critical role in either the development and implementation of quality training and higher education and/or the assessment of qualifications of those who are wishing to enter the sector from overseas. I'll begin today by briefly introducing the presenters who are sitting at the table down here in front of me. First up is Emma Richards. Emma, would you just like to stand up? So Emma is, as I said, from the Training Packages Industry Partner for Children's and Youth Services at ACECQA, one of 11 nationally recognised industry skills councils, and develops qualifications, competencies and skill sets which form the national vocational education training standards for community services and health. Emma has recently coordinated a major project to review and revise the qualifications for early childhood educators in line with the new National Quality Framework for Early Childhood Education and Care. And Emma, I just might ask you to make your way up to the lectern now. But just before Emma begins her presentation, I might just ask our other presenters just to stand. And I'll just briefly introduce you. So Edward Misson from ACER, and I'll give you a bit more of information about Edmund later. And Chris from ACECQA, and likewise I'll tell you a bit more about him when it's his turn to come up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to everyone for coming along to the breakfast this morning. It's definitely a very civilised time to be up and about and talking about qualifications. I guess most of you in the room this morning have probably already started to hear maybe some rumours or a little bit of talk about new qualifications coming out for Certificate 3 and Diploma Early Childhood Education and Care. And I guess that's the reason why I'm here this morning, is to provide you with a little bit of information, but I guess also the big questions that people typically ask. Who is the Industry Skills Council and why do you keep changing the qualifications? What are these big changes and how are they actually going to impact both the people delivering the qualifications but also the students who are undergoing the training? And also, I guess, a little what's next and what does this mean for me? So regardless as to whether you're a training provider, a recruitment agency, or maybe an employer who has a number of staff who are looking to go through their qualification, what sort of things do you need to keep in mind given these new qualifications are officially out and about now? I guess a little bit first about the Industry Skills Council. So I work in the Training Packages team at the Industry Skills Council. We're an organisation that's funded by the Department of Industry, Innovation, Climate Change, Science, Research and Tertiary Education. They keep adding extra words in there, so I do have to keep reading it off the screen. And we're the nationally recognised advisory body on skills and workforce development across the community services and health industry. And one of the key roles that we have is to be continuously improving, updating and maintaining the training packages, so those bundles of qualifications from Certificate 1 all the way up to Advanced Diploma for all the community services and health industries, and that includes early childhood education and care. So the way that we do this is through a process called continuous improvement, where we're always taking on board feedback and recommendations, looking at industry changes and incorporating them into the qualifications. And a couple of years ago, we started to receive information, and our research was showing that there were some really big changes happening in early childhood education and care. And I'm sure I don't need to go into a lot of detail about that to this audience, but definitely indicated that there was a really strong need to update the qualifications. So the Certificate 3 in Children's Services and the Diploma of Children's Services, along with the Certificate 4 in Outside School Hours Care and the Diploma of Outside School Hours Care. In particular, we were hearing about the new regulatory framework, the new rules and regulations, but also hearing a lot of feedback from people about concerns with training consistency and consistency of outcomes. There were some employers out there who were maybe a little bit concerned that they were getting people coming to their workplace who held a Certificate 3 but had never actually interacted with a real child or held a real baby. So they were definite concerns for us. So based with this information and this feedback, we embarked on a project to develop or revise the qualifications for children's services. And we did this through some funding and support from DEWA, the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations. And this process all started a good probably 18 months ago, so beginning of last year. The process was quite long. We undertook a lot of consultation. We had an industry reference group made up of a lot of organisations from the sector, so public and private employers. ACECQA was on that industry reference group. We had the unions, public and private training providers as well. And during that time, we went out and consulted with industry and asked them, well, what are the changes that you want to see with these qualifications? What are your areas of concern? And how can we update these to really make them better and ensure that people who are coming out the other end of the qualifications are really going to be supporting a quality workforce, especially in this, I guess, brave new world of early childhood education and care. So you can probably see on the screen right now some of the big changes that you will see with the new qualifications. I should say these new qualifications were officially endorsed by the National Skills Standards Council on the 17th of June this year, and they went up on the National Training Register on the 1st of July. So they are, I guess, officially out there and ready and available for training providers to use. One of the big changes, and maybe a change that you've already heard a few whispers about, is about this mandatory work placement that's been built into the full suite of qualifications. So at the Certificate 3 and 4 level, there's a mandatory 120-hour work placement, and at the diploma levels, a 240-hour work placement. So this means that every person undertaking these new qualifications will be required to spend a set amount of time in a regulated education and care service. So again, everyone who's coming out with these new qualifications will have at least some real work experience in an education and care service, which we know can be very, very different from changing nappies on baby dolls in a classroom or, at home with your own children. There has been removal of entry requirements across the qualifications as well. So the diploma level qualifications now have free entry. Any student could choose, identify that they want to be a diploma level educator and enrol in that qualification. It does have a few implications for course duration and the amount of units that they would need to undertake, but it does, I guess, give that extra option for people who are looking for a career in early childhood education and care. Workplace assessment is another big one, and virtually every unit of competency across these new qualifications requires assessment in the workplace. So again, you can see that there's a lot of a stronger focus on people getting that real work experience and being assessed in the workplace as well. Some of the other areas that have been enhanced and strengthened in the new qualifications includes cultural competency, inclusion and diversity. It's core in every qualification. We've got a unit in there as well about working effectively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, family and co-workers. So again, strengthening that cultural competency. And there's been enhanced assessment requirements across all of the qualifications. I'm just going to take you through each of the new qualifications now so that you can see, I guess, a big picture of the changes and what you can expect when you start looking at these new qualifications. The first one, the big one, I guess, the Certificate 3 in Early Childhood Education and Care. So this is the qualification that replaces the old Certificate 3 in Children's Services. Things you'll see straight away, definitely the new title. I guess that comes with the new generation of qualifications. It's better to reflect the vocational outcome of this particular qualification. It's got that work placement requirement in it, so every student undertaking this qualification will need to do a 120-hour work placement or work experience. The language has been updated to reflect the National Quality Framework and the National Quality Standards. Provide care for babies is now mandatory in the Certificate 3, so it's something that everyone will need to do. And there's some new units that have been developed addressing holistic child development, using the new learning frameworks and that cultural competency unit as well. So you can start to see already how this new qualification has been, I guess, enhanced to reflect what people really need to do on the job these days if they're looking to work in early childhood education and care. And the next big one, the diploma. So it's now called the Diploma of Early Childhood Education and Care. It replaces the old Diploma of Children's Services, Early Childhood Education and Care. The first thing you'll see, it's got the revised title. It's also got that work placement in it, so it's got a 240-hour work placement. Everyone undertaking this qualification will need to undertake at least 240 hours of work in a regulated education and care service. Again, the language has been updated throughout the qualification, and there's a couple of new units of competency. There's one regarding service management and compliance, so again tying into the new standards and what a person would need to do in a service to ensure that their service is maintaining compliance and meeting the standards. There's a new child development unit, again, which focuses on holistic child development, and that new cultural competency unit. And then the new qualifications for school age education and care. So you can see a new Certificate 4 in school age education and care. That replaces the old Certificate 4 in children's services outside school hours care. Again, the language has been updated. It's been aligned to what the expectations are for someone who's working in school age education and care. It has the work placement, so 120 hours minimum in a approved service. And again, those new child development units, this one focusing on children from 5 to 12 years of age, and the units on using the approved frameworks. And last but not least, the Diploma of School Age Education and Care. So this replaces the old Diploma of Children's Services outside school hours care. Again, you can see the language starting to come through, the new titles. It's been updated in line with the new frameworks, new child development units, and additional units on curriculum planning. So I guess the big thing is that these are quite big changes. So the qualifications, the Certificate 3 and the diploma qualifications really haven't undergone, I guess, this level of change for a number of years. So it does mean that there might be some changes that particularly training providers might need to make when they are looking at these new qualifications and what's going to happen. I guess what it means for educators or people who are currently undertaking the qualification, if you already hold an approved qualification, it's not that you have to go out and redo your qualifications because these new ones have come out. So if it's an approved qualification on the ACECQA approved qualification list, your qualifications are still valid. They're not going to expire. However, if you are currently undertaking a study program, so currently halfway through a Certificate 3 or a diploma, there might be a couple of different options depending on how far you are through. There is a 12-month transition and teach-out time for training providers. So if your educators are going to finish their training program within the next 12 months, then that's perfectly fine and they're able to continue on the course that they're already doing. For people who maybe won't finish within the next 12 months or who want to transition over to the new qualifications, there might be a little bit of mapping work to do, especially depending on what units they've already completed and how far through they are. And I guess that's the thing that we would start to encourage people to look at now. Sit down and have the conversation as to what's going to work best for you, what credit will you get for the training program that you've already undertaken, and what extra work needs to be done to transfer over to the new qualifications. The other big thing to keep in mind is that now that all of these qualifications require a mandatory minimum work placement, centre managers and service directors can probably expect to see more trainees or more training organisations approaching you for a work placement. And I guess this is one of these tricky things where we're going to have to see how it works out. Definitely industry has been saying that yes, we want people coming through qualifications that have real world work experience, but at the same time we need to be able to support that by developing a culture of taking on trainees and providing that real world experience for them. So one of the things that we've been encouraging training organisations to do is sit down and have a conversation with your local employers. Talk about what type of arrangements you can put in place to put your trainees through and maybe what extras you can offer the employers in terms of professional development and start that collaborative relationship early. And as always, if you're unsure as to whether your existing educators meet the qualification requirements, get in contact with ACECQA and they'll be able to provide advice on that. For training organisations, I guess this becomes a little bit more of a big deal because you do have that transition and teach-out time in 12 months. These new qualifications will be the qualifications to deliver. And we just say it's better to start planning now. It's a lot easier to start planning your transition period now rather than 30th of June next year. The new qualifications are available on training.gov.au right now, so you can log on and start looking at them. There will probably be some changes that you need to make, so updating your resources, planning your staff and your staff currency, what strategies that you'll use to transition existing students, what strategies you'll have for offering the diploma if you do offer it as a free entry qualification. So again, we would encourage RTOs to start thinking about this as soon as possible. The Industry Skills Council are currently running a round of national implementation workshops for training organisations. If you'd like to come along and receive a bit more information and professional development around the new qualifications and unpack them in a bit more detail. So definitely if you are interested in attending those workshops, feel free to come to our website. Otherwise, you can always accost me after the session here today and I can provide you with a little bit more information about that. I guess the thing that we'd really like to stress is that it is a lot easier to start your planning now. So particularly if this is the first time that you've heard about the new qualifications, I'd encourage you to jump online, have a look at them because there are a couple of changes which will really impact on the way that you provide these training programs. There's our contact details on the screen there, so make a note of them if you do have any additional questions about the qualifications. Otherwise, I'll hand back over to Anne.
Thank you very much, Emma. And I know that some of you will have questions that you want to ask of Emma, and what I omitted to say at the beginning was that once we've heard from the three presentations, there will be a panel. So you'll get an opportunity to ask questions of each of the presenters today. Our second guest for today is Edmund who is the General Manager of ACER. ACER is the authority responsible for assessing early childhood teachers, among others, but since we're an early childhood conference, we look to the early childhood responsibilities. So that assessing of early childhood teachers under the Department of Immigration and Citizenship Skilled Migration Program. Among Edmund's other responsibilities are the national approach to accreditation of initial teacher education programs, as well as the assessment of overseas teaching qualifications. So welcome, Edmund. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anne, and it's, there I am. It's good to be here this morning and to see the level of interest in these issues. People prepared to get up very early, so it must be important. Just to elaborate a little bit on the question of who ACECL is, we are a Commonwealth-funded agency that is basically about improving the quality of teaching and school leadership in this country. So a lot of our work has been around the development and the implementation of national standards for teachers and for principals, and using those to support schools and individual teachers and school leaders in improving their professional practice. But one part of that role, as Anne said, is to assess the qualifications of teachers or people seeking migration to Australia as teachers. We sort of also normally start with what we're not. I think the important one here is that we are not actually, so we're a bit different to ACECQA, I guess, in that we are not the regulator, and the regulation continues to be carried out by teacher registration boards, institutes of teaching. They have different names in different jurisdictions, but using some of our national processes. So that's relevant here because someone who wants to teach in a place where they need to be a registered teacher in this country may well need to come to us for an assessment for migration, but also to be registered with their one of the state and territory registration boards. And one of our ongoing challenges, which is getting easier as there's more national consistency, is to align those two sets of requirements. So these are the occupations where we are the nominated assessing authority. Relevant this morning is obviously early childhood teacher, but there are, as you see, there are a couple of others that are on the skilled occupations list, and then another lot who are on the consolidated sponsored occupations list, which is sort of, as probably people are aware, sort of the second tier of occupations in demand. The main thing I wanted to do today is just to run through and hopefully be pretty clear about the criteria that we apply when assessing applicants for migration. And as you can see there, there are three broad criteria: the educational, the professional, and then English language. The educational criterion basically is about having a qualification that is equivalent to a degree in Australia, AQF level 7 or higher, and that's one of the, across the board, one of the distinguishing features of the teacher occupation. The professional criterion goes to the question of having an initial teacher education qualification at that level, and that must be at least the equivalent of 1 year of study. The split there is because the teaching occupation or the qualifications for teaching are often in the form of a sort of subject matter degree and then a teaching qualification on top of that. The other really important part of the professional criterion, and this, you know, if I had to nominate one place where we sort of have the most problems often, it's this one, is that you must have, as part of the initial teacher education qualification, undertaken a professional experience placement, a practicum of at least 45 days with the relevant age range of students, so generally in Australia that means you've been working in the settings, a secondary school, a primary school, an early childhood setting. We talk about age ranges because obviously the structures of schooling differ across countries, and we're assessing people with qualifications from all over the world. So this is critically important and is often the distinguishing factor if we're making a determination as to whether someone is a primary school teacher, for example, or an early childhood teacher. That's probably the blurriest line we have in terms of stages of schooling. English language, we rely on the IELTS as the sort of internationally accepted English language test, and those are the scores that people require, or to have studied at a higher education level, at a bachelor degree or higher, basically, in one of those English-speaking countries that the Immigration Department accepts as predominantly English-speaking countries. So, look, those are the criteria, and I just can't emphasise enough that they are the foundation of our assessments, that anybody who's thinking of applying needs to be absolutely crystal clear on those criteria and reasonably confident that they're going to meet them before applying and before spending money on the application, because there is a fee. In some ways, this last slide I think is my most important, because I would encourage you to, or anyone who's interested in applying or supporting someone who's interested in applying, contact our hotline, email us on that email address, overseasquals@aecel.edu.au, and please look at our website where we have done our utmost to communicate those criteria very, very clearly. That doesn't always seem to work, but I hope that between that and actually the capacity to phone up and talk to someone, people should be able to apply to us with reasonable confidence that you will actually be successful. The other final important point I wanted to make is that you don't need to be a registered teacher or to have your qualification recognised by ACECQA, in the case of early childhood, to come and apply to us. So often, particularly if people are not currently in Australia and working in Australia, we're kind of the logical first port of call. But again, if you contact us through those channels, we can certainly provide advice on that. So thank you for your time this morning. I'll be back up on the panel if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. Our final presentation today before the panel convenes will be delivered by Chris Mason. Chris is the Senior Manager of Operations at ACECQA, and he's got responsibility for many of ACECQA's core functions, including qualifications, second-tier review and excellent rating assessments, as well as national audits and training. ACECQA's role as the national authority is to approve qualifications under the National Quality Framework and to undertake assessments of individuals' qualifications. So it's got that dual role. One of the managers in Chris's team is Sue Fox, who's sitting at the table down in front, and we're going to ask Sue to join us when the panel convenes. Sue might well be the voice that you talk to if you've had dealings with ACECQA in relation to the assessment of qualifications. Sue, or somebody in Sue's team, I imagine, has been the friendly voice at the end of the phone helping you through that maze. Since she manages the assessment of applications by individuals who are seeking equivalence for their qualifications, and also the applications from organisations that are wanting to have their qualification added to a ACECQA's list of approved qualifications. So I'll now ask Chris to give us his presentation, and then we'll convene the panel. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everyone. I get the dubious honour of talking while you all eat, which will be nice for us all. And given that we're really keen to hear your questions at the end, particularly having got you up so early on a Friday morning, so I'm going to go pretty fast, but we'll get the chance to revisit anything I mention, and I might suggest that my fellow panel members get stuck into their breakfast pretty rapidly. So you'll hear a lot of talk about raising the bar for quality in early childhood education and care, and this isn't empty talk. You know, there are many tangible ways in which this is happening. We're highlighting 3 here. So a more qualified workforce, a more educators per child, and the assessment and rating process. So about a quarter of services have now been assessed and rated. Every assessment looks at the 7 quality areas. One of those quality areas looks at staffing. 1st of January 2014 is a big milestone in the reform process. So I will dwell on this one just for a little bit, because this is pretty crucial. So the first bullet point is around centre-based services. So from the 1st of January next year, every centre-based service will need to have half of their educators either holding or actively working towards at least an approved diploma, and the other half will have to be holding or actively working towards at least a certificate 3. For family daycare educators will either have to be holding or actively working towards an approved certificate 3, and family daycare coordinators will have to be holding at least an approved diploma. There's no opportunity for the actively working towards a bracket for that category. So who has responsibilities in this realm? Primarily, qualifications are responsibility of approved providers and nominated supervisors. They must ensure that educators at services have the relevant necessary qualifications. Those qualifications will then be checked by the local regulatory authorities through their day-to-day business. And from a ACECQA's perspective, we have responsibility for determining what qualifications are required to be held by the educators. So we can either say, yes, that's a qualification we put on our list. We also have the option to say, particularly for overseas applicants, we can say that their qualification is equivalent to a qualification that we have on one of our published lists. So speaking of those lists, this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, but I'll try to keep it high level if I can. So we've got, starting at the top, it's most straightforward. We've got a series of approved lists. So if you're looking to see whether your qualification, whether it be early childhood teacher, diploma, certificate 3, or outside schoolised care, we have a number of lists on our website that just say, yep, if your qualification is on that list, you are recognised and approved. Outside schoolised care is a little bit more complicated. There's no national requirement, so it's a state-by-state basis. So some jurisdictions have requirements, others don't. Moving down the list and getting a bit more complicated, before the reforms came in, so before 1 Jan 2012, we have lists on our website which are the former approved lists. So if you held those qualifications before the 1st of Jan 2012, you're also recognised and approved. And in the case of early childhood teaching qualifications, as long as you were enrolled before the 1st of Jan 2012, when you graduate, you'll also be recognised if you hold one of those qualifications. And the bottom bullet point, because we have states and territories coming from different starting points, there are some Queensland-specific lists, one of which includes a number of international qualifications. So ACECQA's application process, everything you should need will hopefully be up on our website. We have an application form and supporting guidelines. Those are reviewed relatively frequently. So when we get feedback about what works, what doesn't work for people, we've had a high volume of applications in now, so we're learning about the best way to do the process. So we'll revisit those. So please do give us our feedback about either of those if you have comments. And probably the most important thing from our perspective and for applicants, when you put in an application, please make sure that it is a complete application. So we can't process it until we get everything listed there pretty much. So things around proof of identity, employment history and references, clearly the qualifications themselves are very important. Having the academic transcripts so we can check particularly for overseas qualifications, to make sure that they are equivalent, fulfill the English language requirements, and pay the fee. We can't do it if we don't get the money. When we then assess the applications we receive, it's pretty similar to what Edmund was explaining. So we look at the qualification level. So if you take an example of an early childhood teacher, it needs to be at the ACECQA level 7 or above. We look at the age focus of the qualification. So for example, if it's a birth to 5 qualification, that's clearly ticking the box in terms of covering the age range that we want to be covered. And we look at professional experience. So to use early childhood teachers again as an example, if it's an undergraduate course, we expect to see 80 days of professional experience during that qualification. If it's a postgraduate course, it's 60 days. And clearly, crucially, we look at what was actually covered in the qualification. So we have, as part of the application form and as part of the guidelines, we'll list out examples of the kind of curriculum we'd expect to see for an early childhood teaching degree or a diploma or certificate 3. We can get some pretty straightforward applications in that don't take very long to say, yes, you are ticking all the boxes and you are recognised. We have other ones that are more complicated. So we're seeing more and more birth to 12 qualifications. So this is looking at, we have 2 different functions. We can look at individual applications, so an individual person wants to be recognised by us. We also have the function of recognising courses. So typically Australian university courses, they can apply to us and say, yes, we've got this new course. Will it meet your requirements to be added to your list? So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing more birth to 12 qualifications coming out, and that poses a challenge to us to make sure that there is sufficient early childhood education and care content in there for that course to be recognised. We see quite a few UK and Ireland, particularly applicants, who are basically qualified from the age group 3 upwards. They're missing the birth to 2 age focus that we require. Levelling. Levelling is I've mentioned this a few times because it's a big change that's just come in at the start of this month. So previously, before an applicant could apply to us, if they had an overseas qualification, they needed to get that levelled by a number of different external organisations. That process could be quite costly and take quite a lot of time. We now have the power under the law and regs to do that levelling process ourselves. So hopefully that will be a good news story for applicants. And as Emma's gone into detail, we've just recently, from the 1st of July this year, the Industry Skills Council has launched the new Diploma and Certificate 3 qualifications. So in terms of workload, we've had over 1,400 applications now. About half of those are from people wanting to be recognised as early childhood teachers, and about a third wanting to be diploma level qualified. If you're looking around the country, Western Australia is actually the highest volume jurisdiction, closely followed by New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. By country, so looking at the overseas qualifications that we're seeing, the UK leads the way, followed by New Zealand, Ireland, and then Australia. And if you look at, so we've got over 1,400 in, we've dealt with over 1,100. Based on those 1,100, we're seeing just over 80% are being assessed as equivalent. So I just mentioned quickly some of the changes that have happened. So given that we now have a new Certificate 3 and Diploma, we'll be updating our application form and guidelines to reflect that change. We're also going to try to launch in the near future what we're calling a Qualifications Checker. So just as when I came to the country last year, I went to the immigration website and got talked through, it's one of those online wizards to say what kind of visa did I need to come here. We want the same kind of process for applicants. So before they apply to us, they can get an idea of what bracket do they fall into. And this is particularly important for pre-1 Jan 2012. So before the reforms came in, there's this idea of where you formally recognise under previous laws. And that can be very complicated depending on which jurisdiction you're looking at. So we want to have some sort of step-by-step guide that people can walk through and hopefully get an answer early on, or at least guide them down the right path before they apply. There are various ways to contact us. They're all listed there. I won't talk you through them. And hopefully, we might now have a decent chance for you guys to ask us and quiz us on the panel.
Okay, I think that you can see from Chris's presentation that the assessment of qualifications and educational programs has been a significant workload for ACECQA. I think it's fair to say that it's been unexpectedly high in terms of ACECQA's workload. So congratulations to the the volume and the throughput, Chris, and Sue. Well done. The other thing I just would like to comment on is I think that I've always seen that the area of qualifications as being a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, really. And I think it's just wonderful that we've got the bits of the puzzle here today, ready to answer your questions, I'm sure. Now, some of them may be very tricky if they're about individual circumstances. I'm not sure that we have the capacity to go into those today, but we're certainly happy to take questions on notice and take your name and your contact details and get back to you about those. So without further ado, I might just ask questions from the floor, and you may direct them to whoever you think will answer your question most appropriately.
I just have a question in regards to the early childhood qualification lists on the ACECQA site. At the moment, the lists are purely in relation to domestic qualifications. Is there any intention to expand that to overseas qualifications?
So what we've done recently, so as I said, we've got over 1,400 applications in now, so we've got a very good idea of trends and where the high volume are coming from. We recently wrote to New Zealand universities, so offering them the opportunity to apply to us to get their course approved, and that would automatically mean any new graduates would be recognised by us. The challenge around saying when we get individual qualification from overseas and then saying, yes, we think you're all right, and we think everyone else who went to the same university is all right, it could have been a different time frame, so different year that they graduated. They could have taken a slightly different stream, did different electives. So we're a little bit cautious to go too early to go down that path. We'd much rather institutions came to us. We then get to look at the course as a whole and say, yes, that does meet everything, and then by result of that, anyone having that qualification and graduating would be recognised. So just as we talk to New Zealand, we're also going to talk to the UK and Ireland.
Just second to that, I guess the reason for asking is obviously the time that it takes for the individual assessments to happen. With the levelling being brought into ACECQA, do you see that may increase that time?
Increase it?
Improve the time, sorry.
We're hoping it will improve it, yeah. So it's additional workload for us, but we're pretty confident that we can turn it around faster than it has been in the past.
Just over there in the very back by the window, thank you.
Can the higher education institution count the diploma hours, given that it's going to be 240 hours, count those when that person moves into a higher education early childhood course? Is it up to the institution that whether those hours be counted as the 0 to 5 component?
Emma, do you want to take that one?
I'll answer it. At the moment, there's no nationally accepted credit arrangements from vocational education, say diploma courses, to university courses. They tend to be negotiated on an institution-to-institution basis. So at this point, I would say that would be something that you would need to negotiate with your university or higher education institution if you're looking at building pathways from the diploma to the degree qualifications, and it would probably be up to the university whether or not they take that on board. Yeah.
Here's the microphone.
People who are currently accredited teachers but not in early childhood, and they would like to do postgraduate work to enable them to be skilled to teach at early childhood level, what is that minimum requirement expectation?
Okay, so I think on the teaching side, a registered teacher or an accredited teacher in New South Wales is an accredited teacher, and there's actually no regulatory impediment to an early childhood teacher teaching Year 12 physics if they can find someone to give them that job. So I think on the sort of straight teaching side, there's no specific requirement except for what an employer might want. On the migration side, if you wanted to migrate as a teacher on the basis that you are an early childhood teacher, you would need to have met those criteria I've outlined. So you'd want, for example, to make sure that whatever postgraduate qualification you were doing, included 45 days of practicum in that setting, for example, and you'd want to check our other criteria pretty carefully if it was a migration outcome was part of the rationale for doing it. But
And just from our perspective, so this is quite a hot topic at the moment. So as I said, 1st of Jan is a big milestone with the qualification requirements coming in. Our board have been closely monitoring, how we're doing in terms of stats, the volume that's coming in, what issues we're seeing. So there's recently been a decision that we need to just iron out the final details of. So we hope to be in a situation to publish our position by the end of this month. But if we're talking about registered primary school teachers, we are now at a position to say, if they then go on to achieve an approved diploma, we will recognise that as being equivalent to an early childhood teacher.
And that diploma is, it can be level 5, level 6, or we're talking about a graduate diploma?
No, it could be AQF level 5 or above. So it can be one of the approved diplomas on our list, or it could even be an overseas applicant. So if they come to the country, get teacher registration here, we're confident about their primary level qualification, so it covers the age range 5 to 8, for instance, and they then have an equivalent diploma level qualification from overseas, we would assess that and would say that that's equivalent to an ECT.
And needless to say, the board and ACECQA will be monitoring that, and it is time limited and subject to review. So it's basically a transition arrangement to recognise that from 1 January there'll be a lot of services out there that are looking for a teacher. We'd prefer that they have a teacher in their service rather than a waiver. You all understand that services can apply for waivers, but where possible, where they can get somebody who has the commitment to early childhood who will undertake the diploma, then we see that as a good transition model for the time being. Look back in a minute.
Hello. Edmund, I don't know whether you can answer this, and perhaps Sue, you have some commentary as well, but I'm interested in the recognition of educational settings in terms of registration and recognition of early childhood teachers, and looking at it from an institutional perspective, consideration of prior to school context, particularly from an ACER perspective. I was wondering if you're able to comment on that from a whole course perspective rather than a individual migration perspective.
yeah, so in terms of registration of early childhood teachers, that is still a bit of a patchwork across the country, as probably some people are aware. I think in most states, teachers in pretty much any setting can be registered. The variation is more in whether they're required to be, and also this is an area where things are changing. So, I know a number of states have announced plans to extend that scope of where you must be a registered teacher. WA springs to mind, and certainly been South Australia and Victoria. There's certainly been some talk for some time now. I think here too in New South Wales, actually, the Great Teaching Inspired Learning policy statement talked about at least an investigation of whether this was a good idea. So, in that sense, I think, it's a bit of a mix, but it's moving in the direction of registering and recognising teachers in those settings, and then that really does flow through into, say, the accreditation of qualifications and so on. I guess from a really broad ACER perspective, we are pretty comfortable that in broad terms, our teaching standards, the way we talk about teaching, the support materials we provide are applicable across the whole range of settings where teachers teach, and that's from early childhood to senior secondary to the teacher at the zoo, But we are conscious and probably have more work to do in tailoring some of those specific support materials for different groups of teachers. So I just think this is really an evolving area where things are changing so rapidly. And, you know, this morning we've sort of been hearing about all the changes in the early childhood sector. You know, I think we'll see a very different and more professionalised picture in 5 to 10 years' time than we see now.
Thank you, Edmund. Sue, did you want to add to that?
I'd just like to add, we are working together with ACER and ATRA. ATRA is the Teacher Regulatory Authority group to try and streamline the process that occurs for higher ed institutions to apply for early childhood teacher quals to be added to the list. Some states and territories have in their legislation a minimum requirement of professional experience that needs to occur in a school setting. We have a minimum requirement of the 10 days in birth to 2. And so we're just trying to work through those particular issues. I think all of us across ATRA and ACECQA are learning more and more about the intricacies of those differences and how we can actually improve that process for everybody. So it's definitely high on our agenda, and we've just been working closely with Queensland College of Teachers, and we hope to expand that across other jurisdictions in the near future.
Yes?
Emma, my question is for you specifically around the new first aid unit of competency. I'm just trying to, I guess, work out the best strategies for us to transition from the current HLTFA to the education and care one. Is there any thought around that, as in the best way for us to do that, or at what time frame we would be certainly recommending to those refreshing first aid within that vocation to be doing specifically that one? Because a lot of our educators will attend public classes where they're mixed, and we certainly don't want to segregate them, but at what point do we say this one is the qualification?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind, I should mention, so there's a new first aid unit that's been developed specifically for early education and care settings, and so it deals with asthma and anaphylaxis. It has quite specific requirements about demonstrating CPR on an infant, a child and an adult, so it's like the regular, I guess, apply first aid with extra bits specific for early childhood education and care. My understanding is that your standalone first aid would remain on the ACECQA approved first aid list. The benefit of the new first aid unit is that it ticks all 3 boxes, so first aid, asthma and anaphylaxis. So theoretically there's no reason why a person couldn't continue to hold standalone first aid and a separate asthma and anaphylaxis. It's a matter of down the track whether they decide to then go on and just do the one size fits all course that covers everything. As far as transition from the sort of the regular first aid to the new early childhood first aid, that would be up to you. Both units are current at the moment, so there's no requirement, I guess, to transfer over. But definitely if you've got people coming through who are starting to undertake the new qualifications, so the new Certificate 3 and the new diploma, it's a requirement of the core of those qualifications to do the new first aid unit. So
Is it probably important if they've got a current HLTFA
yeah.
and they're coming through and doing their qual? So we basically, in effect, we're getting them to sit through it again because we can't credit that component. Yeah.
There'll be some, volume's gone up. There'll be some parts of the unit if you do a mapping between the two, and at this point in time it would still be a manual mapping that you need to do as an RTO. There would be some parts that map over because the new one includes adult first aid as well. It would just be all the extra things, so that you would need to maybe do a bit of gap training and get that done.
Sue, do you want to add anything? More questions, and I'm conscious that I can't see beyond this thing, so if there's anyone madly waving their arm over there, let me know. But here we've got somebody, thank you.
I've got an inquiry in regards to the current diploma that's being delivered now to the new diploma that comes in next year. I've got an educator working for me that has fallen pregnant, and she won't have finished her, she's under a traineeship, So she can't work, obviously, while she's having the baby and taking maternity leave. And the RTO has told us that we have to cancel her traineeship. She's been doing it all year, and that there's no mapping across to the new one. So she's actually lost 8 months of really hard work. And whilst I implore the changes, and I know that we've had some issues with embracing the early years, the National Quality Framework, and that the existing qualifications haven't quite met those challenges. She's done 8 months of really hard work that is now not being acknowledged. I've rung a couple of RTOs, and the only thing I can get from them is that she has to come back to work almost immediately and work 2 days a week, which she doesn't want to do. She wants to bond with her baby. So I feel that whilst we embrace the changes, there are some people that are being disadvantaged by it. And of course I take on the role of looking after my educators as much as I possibly can. And I just feel awful that somebody has done 8 months worth of work that will no longer be taken into account. And I know she knows that she's learnt from it, but it's still eight months of her life.
Yeah.
Emma, is that a question that you can answer now, or would you prefer to do a one-on-one later?
It might be a good idea to have a chat later on. I guess the first thing I will say is that even though the old diploma and the new diploma aren't considered equivalent, there are a lot of areas of overlap. So what we have been saying is that while you might not be able to get a direct credit transfer for the work that you've done, there should be some recognition of what you've already done. So definitely, by the sounds of it, it's not a matter when you're transitioning to the new qualification that you have to go right back to square one and start from scratch. So there might be a couple of things that we can work out. Also keep in mind that the regulations for RTOs, there is a clause that allows for if a student is going to be severely disadvantaged by the transition and teach out, there are allowances for extra time and special arrangements that can be made. So there might be a couple of different avenues that you can take with this particular educator, and I'd be happy to have a chat with you about
that
those.
That would be really good, because at the moment I'm just hitting a brick wall.
Yeah. Well, it's good that we've got Emma here today then. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes? Microphone?
Hi, look, I don't know whether this question can even be answered here at this point, but we are doing some school-based trainees within this industry, and I guess under the ruling of, in relation to the regs where an educator can be under 18 years of age but supervised, I guess one of the things that as an RTO we need to be aware of is the fact that that opens some doors for some high risk in some centres, whereby we may have an 18-year-old educator supervising a 16-year-old school-based trainee during those maybe quiet times in a centre's operation, that sort of thing. I know that's not the direct responsibility of an RTO, but I'm just wondering the clear guidelines around that, because I know that it used to be very stipulated that you couldn't have someone under the age of 18. It just, for me, I'm concerned that, you know, with the rising costs of labour and all of that in a centre, that they're very concerned about rising costs, that there may be some, unclear lines, I guess, as far as how we manage that. Because if it's just that they can be under 18 and supervised, do you understand my question?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
I guess what I'm saying, and the industry people in here, it may be worth considering.
This might be a conversation that we need to have with you afterwards, but Chris, is there anything you'd like to say at this
So
stage?
just briefly, so you absolutely correctly reflected what it says. So if you're under 18, you need to be supervised. It's not something that we have direct responsibility for, so it's more of a regulated authority in different jurisdictions question, but we do work very closely with them, and we have lots of working groups, one of which looks at issues around the implementation of the National Quality Framework. So this is one where we can definitely pick up and look whether we want to have some additional guidance around high risk and maybe steering people away from that situation that you highlighted.
And I think it's fair to say ACECQA's role as a regulator, it does have some functions that it's primarily responsible for, but it also has an overarching role which is around the consistency with which the regulations and the processes are deployed by the regulatory authorities. So I think I hear your concern, and I think that's something that we'll probably keep an eye on. It's be something. There is a group called QUAC, which basically consists of the senior regulators in each of the states and territories that meets on a regular basis by teleconference with senior people from ACECQA, and those kinds of issues are where that's the forum to thrash out some of those issues. So I think we'll take your question on notice and just do a bit of a recce, really, to see how it's going from across all of the regulatory authorities. Thank you for your question. The lady at the back here, and then the next. Yes, good.
Just a question regarding the diploma qualified staff at long day care. Of the 50% that have to be diploma qualified, is there any percentage of those who can be working towards, or can you essentially have all your diploma qualified positions filled with people working towards?
So you can essentially have them all actively working towards, yes.
Okay. That seems to be almost a reduction in the number of people who are qualified. Because you're actually, not everyone's finished their course, so you could have people who are sent to when not everyone holds their diploma qualified certificate as yet.
But that doesn't overrule the requirements around having a teacher, depending on what size service you have.
Mm-hmm. So in your rooms, you could have a diploma qualified in each room who is working towards?
Yes.
I guess that I hear your concern behind that question too, and I think it's important when we look at the new National Quality Framework to see how it is much more focused on outcomes than, well, I can speak for the Queensland legislation, which was focused on inputs largely, and then we had the NCAC accreditation process that looked at processes and outcomes. So I think you've got to kind of balance it up between the flexibility that services have, but at the end of the day, they are assessed and rated on their quality. And so I think that, checks and balances are the name of the game in terms of the National Quality Framework, but I do hear your concern. And again, it's something I think, Chris, that the QUAC might want to look at. You've got something?
Yeah, and so it might be worth trying to unpack actively working towards at this point, which is dangerous for me to try to do because it does get complicated, but I'll give it a go. So just try and reassure you, you can't just be actively working towards a diploma just because you've enrolled on a diploma level course. So if we start at the bottom, so Certificate 3, to be actively working towards Certificate 3, you do only have to be enrolled and making satisfactory progress. But to be recognised as diploma level under actively working towards, you either need to already hold a Certificate 3 or hold the list of competencies from the Certificate 3 that we have published on our website. So it's not like you can just enrol in diploma and suddenly we recognise you as actively working towards.
And you have to be making reasonable progress. Indeed. And so on and so forth, so there is some, some caveats.
It just seemed before we had to apply for a waiver, we've had staff who seemed to be quite close to completing their diploma, and you'd have to apply for a waiver before, and sometimes that wasn't approved. It just appears like now it seems to be easier.
Well, hopefully it will at least be a more consistent process now.
Yeah. And there was a lady over here.
I have two questions now. One question, Chris, on what you've just said. Considering the changes that are coming in that people can enrol directly in a diploma and they won't have the requirements to have completed the Certificate 3 beforehand, how does that affect your definition then of actively working towards?
Yep, so this is one of the things that we'll be updating in the very near future. So as Emma mentioned, there are commonalities still between the new diploma and Certificate 3. We had up on our website previously a list of Certificate 3 units that we said would fit the definition of actively working towards. What we now need to do is pick up the 11 that are common between the two. And so it's not a massive change, it's making sure that we do align it so when people look, it does make sense, we do reflect what the new qualifications look like, and it's those 11 that you would need to hold to be recognised actively working towards a diploma.
Thank you very much. The second question, which was my original question, Chris, you mentioned in your segment about people coming from particularly the UK that don't have their 0 to 3 component recognised, or they haven't achieved it. What's the advice that you guys are supplying to those people about what happens in that situation, and also what can they do to gain that 0 to 3 component? Sue, it's probably a question for you.
We have been able to suggest that they complete non-award units, and some people have commenced doing that. And the board has also agreed to accepting extensive, significant work experience. So the person might not have studied that information, but they have actually taught or worked with birth to 2-year-olds for a number of years, or number of months or whatever. So we assess those on a case-by-case basis. And I think there's some more work that the board has been doing on that will be announced in the next few weeks.
So it would be like non-accredited professional development, that's what you mean by non-accredited courses?
By non-award units. Non-award units, we ask that they enrol in a university unit or 2, depending on what the content of those units are, to cover the pedagogy and the professional experience with birth to 2s. So, yeah, it's actually at the higher education level.
All right. I'd just like you to join with me in thanking all of our guests. I've found it a very useful and informative morning, and I'm sure you have as well. So thank you very much to all of you.